Welcome everybody. I'm Tanea Bannon with the Clifton Park Half Moon Public Library, and today we have Lisa Dougherty presenting on understanding your ancestry DNA. And before I turn it over to Lisa, I just want to mention that our next program with Lisa will be on August 10th at the same time, and that will be choosing and using genealogy software. So be sure to sign up for that if you're interested. And I will turn it over to Lisa now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. This is a great topic. It's kind of a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I'm probably what might be considered a newcomer to DNA testing. It's been about 3 years since I did my test. And prior to doing the test, I had absolutely zero knowledge. And when I say zero, I mean zero. So if you are in a position where you don't really know a lot about DNA testing, or maybe you've done a test and you haven't really dove into it very deeply, hopefully we're going to be able to give you a little bit of an understanding today and give you some things that you can maybe take a look at what your test means and get a little bit more out of it than just kind of giving it a surfacey look. So to get started, here's some of the topics we're going to talk about today. And some of them will go into a little bit more depth than others, but this is just meant to give you a kind of an overview. And we're going to be mostly talking about ancestry today. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The basic reason is because most people test at Ancestry. They have the biggest number of testers, and also because it's the test that I'm personally the most familiar with. So some of the other tests I don't feel quite as confident in, and so might not feel very good about giving a complete presentation about them. But for Ancestry, it's something I use pretty much every day, so I'm pretty comfortable talking about it. So we're going to go over things about DNA basics, what kinds of tests there are, and some of the testing companies. Why would you want to test with Ancestry? A little bit about the ethnicity estimates, because there's an awful lot of confusion surrounding those. We're going to talk about some common myths about DNA, because I'm sure there are some of these that you've heard that are swirling around, and maybe if you talk about DNA with your friends and family, they might be some of the people that believe these things about DNA. So we'll debunk some of the myths. Talk briefly about who you should be testing to find out information. What about the matches that you get with a DNA test? And also where to find more information. One thing about DNA is that it's constant education. So it's not you just learn about it and then you're done. It's more like you learn about it and then you keep on learning. So finding information is very important, and it's important to know where to find that information. So we'll be talking about that at the end. All right, so some things about basics, just basic stuff about DNA. This is a great quote from Blaine Bettinger, and if you get involved in any way with DNA testing, if you get involved in using DNA for your family history, you're going to learn the name Blaine Bettinger, and you're going to probably see a lot of the webinars that he does, and you're hopefully going to read his book, which is called The Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy. And this is a quote from that book. And it really gets to the heart of what DNA testing is and what it's giving to us as far as working with our family history. Genetic genealogy is an essential tool for genealogists. It is an important piece of evidence, similar to a census record, will, or land record. And it might be the last piece of information available in locations where records have been lost or destroyed. And we've all certainly come across that in our research. Although DNA testing cannot answer every question, savvy genealogists should at least consider it as a part of every genealogical research project. So DNA is being seen these days as just as important of a piece of information as a census record would be, or a birth record, or a will, or a land record. So DNA is being used as another important piece in the puzzle for our family history. So just keep that in mind. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the types of tests. Now, this is where some of the confusion over DNA comes in. There are 3 types of DNA tests that have the potential for being useful when it comes to doing our family history. The first test is called a Y chromosome DNA test, and that's abbreviated as Y-DNA. And a Y-DNA test is the type of test that will measure the DNA that is passed down from father to son. So the Y-DNA test only looks at one chromosome, and that's the Y chromosome. Now, of course, one of the disadvantages with a Y-DNA test is that if you're a female, you can't take this test because you don't have a Y chromosome. So back in the early days of genetic genealogy, this was one of the tests that was available and probably the most widely used tests in the early days of genetic genealogy. So the result was females would go and track down their closest living Y chromosome donor, or a brother, an uncle, a cousin, just someone who was male that could take the test. Another disadvantage with a Y-DNA test is that it measures DNA that goes back thousands of years. So it really is sort of limited in its usefulness for what we can use it for our paper trail genealogy. So we're really looking at DNA that's thousands of years old with a Y test. And similarly, with a mitochondrial DNA test, we're also looking at DNA that's thousands of years old. And mitochondrial DNA is passed from a mother to her child. So it's passed to both males and females, but it's only passed from a mother to a child. So a father doesn't pass on mitochondrial DNA. And again, these tests are measuring DNA that predates our paper trails by thousands of years. So a mitochondrial DNA test has also very limited applications for genealogy. Well, that's where the autosomal DNA test comes in. And the autosomal test is the test that's being given with most of the testing companies that we are seeing advertised today. So when you see the TV commercials for Ancestry or for 23andMe, they're talking about an autosomal DNA test. And an autosomal DNA test measures the DNA that you inherit from any ancestor. So it could be an ancestor on your mother's side, it could be an ancestor on your father's side. And the difference also with an autosomal test is that these tests measure DNA that has been inherited, say, in about the last 500 years. So this type of test is very valuable for our paper trail genealogy. A lot of us have very difficult time going back 100, 200, 300 years. So within 500 years should be sufficient for us to be able to get some information from an autosomal DNA test. So just to remember about Ancestry, Ancestry only offers an autosomal DNA test. They do not offer Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA. The only company that's currently doing that right now is Family Tree DNA. So if you have taken an Ancestry test, you have taken an autosomal test. And your autosomal test will give you matches from both your maternal and your paternal ancestors. That's an area of confusion. A lot of people still think that the DNA tests that we take today are gender linked, and they are not. You will find matches from both sides of your family with an autosomal test. So one thing that we want to remember when we're talking about DNA is that we want to remember that DNA inheritance is random. It's very random. So the randomness of it means that you don't know what you're going to inherit from what ancestor. Generally, we inherit about 50% of our DNA from our parents. So 50% from your mother and 50% from your father. And when we go back to our grandparent generation, we're inheriting about 25% from each grandparent. However, that number can vary. The lower we go, or the further back we go, the more the number can vary. Generally, you will inherit DNA from all of your great-great-grandparents. When you get further back, there's no guarantee that you will inherit any DNA from 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 of those great-great-great-grandparents. So in other words, the further back we go, it's not guaranteed that you are going to inherit DNA from those people. That's the advantage in having a sibling test, because a sibling isn't going to inherit the same exact DNA that you are. The sibling is going to inherit 50% from your mother, 50% from your father, but you don't know which 50%. So that's where the randomness of DNA inheritance comes in. So one of the things that Blaine Bettinger talks about in his book are the different family trees. Everyone is familiar with the genealogical family tree that we see on the left. That's the tree that we fill in with the names and the dates of all of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. But the family tree on the right, the genetic family tree, is the family tree of the ancestors that we inherit DNA from. So you can see we look at the parent generation, the grandparent generation, the great-grandparent generation, the great-great-grandparent generation. When we get back to the great-great-great-grandparent generation, you can see that there's some white spaces. And that just shows that this individual has not inherited DNA from those particular great-great-great-grandparents. So our genetic family tree is going to be a little less complete than our genealogical family tree. Does it mean that we're not related to those people? No, it just means that we didn't inherit DNA from them. And again, our sibling may have inherited DNA from them, or a cousin may have inherited DNA from them. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, why should I have my friend or my sister or my brother test? Because we're just going to have the same DNA. Well, that's not true. You inherit slightly different DNA. So as I was saying before, you inherit 50% of your DNA from your mother and 50% of your DNA from your father. However, you don't know what 50% you're inheriting. So a good analogy might be that your parents get together and they make vegetable soup. And when you come up to the soup pot, you dip your label in, and when you pull out your serving, you get 3 carrots, 2 potatoes, and 1 pea. When your sister dips in her ladle, she gets 1 carrot, 5 potatoes, and 7 peas. So you're getting the same soup, but you're not getting exactly the same serving. So that's a way to look at how DNA is inherited between siblings of the same parents. I like to show this graphic because this shows ethnicity estimates for siblings. Now, these two are full siblings. They have the same mother and the same father. You can see that their ethnicity estimates are quite different. DB has got all kinds of pie pieces in different colors, whereas BD only has 2 and maybe a third one that's very small. So you can see that even though they have the same parents, they've inherited very different DNA from those parents. So that's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to have your siblings test, because they may end up with something that you just don't have, and you wouldn't be aware of it if you didn't test your sibling. Okay, so a little bit about the other testing companies. So Ancestry is the one that we're mainly concerned with today, but there are others. Probably Ancestry's next largest competitor would be 23andMe. 23andMe has a decent sized database. They don't have the size database of Ancestry. I think they're about half. But if you are working on an unknown parentage case, or if you are working on an adoption situation, then you definitely want to test with 23andMe in addition to Ancestry. So generally, you want to have your DNA with all the companies. Family Tree DNA was the company that started DNA testing for genealogy, and they are still around today. They have a significantly lower amount of testers, but they also have a bank of testers that would be useful to compare to. MyHeritage has a decent number of testers. They're a company out of Israel. They are known for having a large amount of international testers. So if you are looking for matches in Europe, that might be the way to go with MyHeritage. And then also there's Living DNA. That is a company out of the UK. Most of their testers currently are in the UK. So you can also get some matches there. You can get an interesting ancestry ethnicity report from Living DNA, but they're definitely the smallest of all of them. So that's just a little overview. One thing that you should know is that to get into the Ancestry DNA database or the 23andMe database, you have to do a test at both of those places if you want to get into those databases. If you want to get into Family Tree DNA or Living DNA or MyHeritage, you can use your Ancestry or 23andMe data in any of those. So that's definitely possible. And beyond the scope of today's discussion, but that's something that you can do just to keep it in the back of your mind. A little comparison between the companies. They're all right around the same price as far as testing goes. MyHeritage tends to be the least expensive, and they also have have sales all the time. So I would say at least every other month they're having a sale. Ancestry tends to have sales maybe 3 or 4 times a year. They generally will lower their price to $59 for a test around the major holidays. I would guess the next one might not be till Thanksgiving, but they do have sales and you can get good deals on the tests. So if you haven't done it yet, you might have to wait a little while to get a decent sale. All right, so why would we want to test at Ancestry? Of all those choices that we have, why would we want to test? Well, probably the biggest reason for testing at Ancestry would be because they have the largest database for potential matches. So they have the largest amount of testers. I believe the latest numbers are somewhere around 16 million people that have tested with Ancestry. I would say unless you are an extremely recent immigrant, like within the last 25 years, then the likelihood that you would have 0 matches at Ancestry is 0. You are absolutely going to have matches on Ancestry. So it's definitely worth going into. Most people, if they have colonial ancestry in this country, have thousands of matches, somewhere in the 50 to 100,000 range. So there's quite a lot of matches on there. Ancestry makes it the easiest to do your genealogy and couple it with your DNA test. Of all of the companies, Ancestry gives you the biggest database to use for researching. It also, as we've seen, gives you the largest database for potential matches. So they work hand in hand. The genealogy piece and the DNA piece work very well together at Ancestry. You can download your DNA information, as I was just mentioning, and you can upload it to other sites like Family Tree DNA or MyHeritage. So Ancestry does allow you to do that. It does not allow you to take your information from another site and upload it to their website. So that's why we have to test an Ancestry. If you buy a DNA test and you are going to do the DNA test at Ancestry, you have to have an account. It's a free account. You sign up for the account with your email and you sign up a password and your results are delivered to you via the Ancestry website. So you don't get anything in the mail. It all comes to your email and you log into your account and then you can see your DNA. You do not have to purchase a membership to look at your DNA. You can look at it, you can see your matches, you can see your ethnicity report. You don't have to have a paid account to do that. If you want to do genealogy research and start a tree, then you will need to purchase a membership. So just to keep that in mind. So theoretically, the only cost to the tester is the cost of the test. So when I do an Ancestry DNA test, what do I get? What do I get with it? Well, you're going to get 2 main places to look at. The first one is the ethnicity estimate, which is something that most people are associating with DNA tests. That's the thing that is advertised on TV. That's the guy that trades his lederhosen in for a kilt. That's where most people are thinking that a DNA test has the most information. Well, that's kind of only the tip of the iceberg. The ethnicity estimate is an estimate. The matches are the part that are really going to help you with your family history. So a little bit about these ethnicity estimates. And I've got the word estimate large and in bold because it is the most important piece of this phrase, ethnicity estimates. So the reason we need to look at that is we need to realize that these are estimates. If I have an estimate that's telling me that I'm 57% Irish, I'm 57% Irish compared to the people in the database that are there for comparison. That doesn't mean that I'm 57% Irish and I'm going to stay that way for the rest of my life. That just means that that's what the database is showing in its current inclination. Ethnicity estimates, just a few of the things that I've seen around Facebook and the genetic genealogy groups about ethnicity estimates. Some of them are actually kind of funny. They've been described as cocktail party conversation, eye candy, ethnicity guesstimates. They're generally only reliable to the continent level. So if somebody's telling me that I'm 57% Irish, what that means is that I'm at least 57% European. So generally, if you think in terms of continental divides, then yes, the estimates can be fairly accurate. Unfortunately, most people tend to think that Irish is a separate ethnicity, German is a separate ethnicity, and really these ethnicity estimates can't really tell us with any great specificity about those different breakdowns. So when we submit our DNA, to come up with an ethnicity estimate, Ancestry will compare our DNA sample with the samples from a reference population. A reference population are people that are handpicked from a certain area that meet particular criteria. One of the criteria is that a reference person might have 4 grandparents all born within 50 miles of each other, all with known ancestry in a particular region. So you can tell that that's fairly specific as far as what a reference population is. Now, this is an example of what the reference population was back when my Irish ethnicity estimate was 57%. At that time, my DNA was being compared against a reference population of 154 people. So I don't know about you, but I don't feel too confident about an ethnicity estimate that is only based on comparing my DNA with 154 people. There's a lot more Irish people in the world than 154. But that was the size of the reference population when this calculation was done. Now, since then, the reference population has grown. I believe it is now up to about 16,000 people worldwide. Now, when we're talking about 16,000 people, we're talking about 16,000 people of all ethnicities, not just Irish. We're talking 16,000 people total to give everybody an ethnicity estimate of some type of ethnicity. So again, it's becoming more refined, but it's not real specific. It may never get real specific. It just is what it is. So ethnicity estimates are fun and they bring people in, but they're not the be all and the end all. They're just there to basically let people see an average or just a little sampling of what their ethnicity could possibly be. So the moral of the story is we don't want to take them too seriously, and we don't want to base any grave family decisions on ethnicity estimates. So they're just kind of, I don't want to use the word fun, but they're not quite as specific as they could be or even will be. So it's a work in progress. Maybe that's how we should put it. And another thing too to be aware of is that if you do test at another company, or if you do upload your DNA to another company, you're not going to get the same ethnicity estimates as what you got on Ancestry. And why is that? Well, it's because each company uses a different reference population. So Ancestry and 23andMe are in competition with each other. They are not going to use the same people for reference populations. They each have their own separate. So their ethnicity estimates are going to be slightly different than the ones you would get at Ancestry. And the same thing at MyHeritage or at Family Tree DNA, you're going to have variations. So just expect that. There's nothing definite about ethnicity estimates. All right, so the meat and potatoes of the DNA test are your matches. Matches are people that share DNA with you. So when you test with Ancestry or with any other company, you will be matched with people in the database who share DNA with you. And this could range from people that are distant cousins to maybe people that you know who have tested, who are your known relatives, like cousins or siblings or whatever. Or you could get on there and find a list of people that you have no idea who any of them are. Any of those scenarios is certainly possible. But the thing that you can be assured of is that if these people that are high on your match list are listed, they're related to you in some way. You may not know how, but they are related to you. So a DNA match is somebody in your that you has taken a test with the same company, in this case Ancestry, who shares DNA with you. So important things to remember are that if you've taken a test at Ancestry and your cousin took a test at 23andMe, you are not going to match them because you're not in the same database. If you test with Ancestry and your cousin tests with Ancestry and you're still not a match, well, then something's going on. But in general, whoever tests at the same company that you do, who matches you, is your relative. So the example I'm showing here is my son. And Ancestry is telling us that we share 3,440 centimorgans of DNA. And that indicates that this is a parent or child relationship. So they don't know which. All they know is that Sam and I share 3,440 centimorgans. So that's enough for Sam to either be my parent or my child. So we're going to see in a minute that Ancestry uses those numbers to predict relationships. Ancestry doesn't have a magic mirror. They can't tell you what a relationship is for certain, but they can guess based on the amount of shared DNA. So when you look at your match list, when you look at them, you're going to see that matches are arranged from the closest to the most distant. So the person that's at the top of your match list is the person that matches you the most closely of anybody that has tested with Ancestry or with any other testing company. Your match list is updated every single time a new tester comes into the database that matches you. So pretty much you get new matches every day. You may not get high matches every day, but you will get new matches every day. Occasionally you'll get a high match, which is somebody that you know or somebody that you should figure out. It doesn't happen as much as it used to, unfortunately. I don't think as many people are testing now as were a couple of years ago. But you do still get new matches, and all of those matches are some relation to you. So as I was mentioning before, Ancestry uses the number of shared centimorgans to predict how people are related to you. Well, Ancestry doesn't have a crystal ball. They don't know. They can't tell how a person is related to you, but they can guess, and they do guess. So one of the phrases that they use as a guess is close family to first cousin. So close family could mean a lot of different things. So the reason I show these two, Charles and Catherine, is because both of them are closely related to me, but neither of them is a first cousin, which means they fall into the close family category. So Charles, close family, first cousin, shares 1,789 centimorgans of DNA with me. He happens to be my nephew. Catherine shares 1,428 centimorgans with me. She happens to be my aunt. So you can see those are both close relations, but they're not first cousins. So don't let these labels throw you. These labels are only Ancestry's attempt at guessing how these people are related to you. You can see if you were adopted and you opened up these matches and you saw these relationships, you would want to know how these people were related to you. And that's how adoptees figure out who their birth families are, by testing and by getting these close relationships among their matches. So the relationships that Ancestry gives you are predictions. They're only predictions. They're based on shared amounts of DNA only. They are not going into your tax returns or your family trees or looking at anything private that will tell you how they're related. They're only basing it on the amount of centimorgans that you share with your match. And they all fall in ranges. So unless it's a parent-child relationship, every DNA relationship falls in a range. The less amount of DNA that you share with someone, the bigger the range is going to be. And so each range contains a variety of possible relationships. And those are the relationships that you have to calculate using your tree and the trees of your matches. Once we get past the close family category, Ancestry classifies every relationship in a degree of cousinship. So they're not going to tell you this person's your aunt or your nephew. They're only going to say cousin. So they may be a great aunt. They may be a great grandparent. but they're not going to tell you that in those terms. They're just going to use the degrees of cousinship. So keep that in mind. So ignore those predictions and look at the amount of centimorgans. That's the important thing. The number that you see right in front of the little c and the big M. That's the important thing to look at. So Charlie is my nephew. He falls in the range of nephew. If you look at how Ancestry interprets the relationship of 1,789 centimorgans, and you can see niece and nephew is on that list. And that is his relationship to me. There are also calculators available online that tell you the possibilities, and they map them out very nicely like this. That is in the handout that we have for this presentation. And there's also these little handy charts, which there are also links to on the handout, that tell you what different relationships are and the average amounts. So it's very important to take a look at these charts because they can give you a lot of information. And here is a very important website. You're going to be using this a lot. This is where you will find the relationship calculator for the number of centimorgans you share with a match. It's a wonderful tool, and it's something that you'll be using quite a lot of if you delve into this. All right, so now let's look at a couple of myths about DNA testing. Okay, so one of the things that sometimes people believe is that when they do a DNA test, when they get it back, they're going to have a family tree that's already done, completely filled out with all of the names of their ancestors and all of the dates. And that's just not true. And we have seen that what we get with a test are ethnicity estimates, and we get matches. You may very well be connected with a match from your DNA test who can give you a complete family tree. But again, that's something that has to be worked out. You have to work out the genealogy. You have to connect with other people. That's something that requires some work. It isn't just going to happen with a DNA test. And also, we've seen that you don't have to be a male only to get a genealogy DNA test. That was back in the old days. That was a long time ago. Now anybody can take an autosomal DNA test and you can use it for your genealogy. My DNA matches should include all of my genealogical relatives. Well, if we go back to our genetic family tree versus our genealogical family tree, we know that's not true because we don't inherit DNA from all of our genealogical relatives. My ethnicity estimates should match my known genealogy paper trail. Again, we're talking about estimates here. We're talking about shifting borders in different countries. Germany wasn't always Germany. Poland wasn't always Poland. So we have a lot of shifting and we have a lot of estimates, and there's a lot of things wrong with estimates matching a paper trail. So it's just not an exact science. Taking a DNA test will reveal my health information. Well, not unless you want it to. Ancestry and 23andMe both have a health component that you can purchase separately for your DNA test. It's not something that is included with the DNA test for genealogy, but it is possible to do it. If you want to do it, it can be done. Your DNA information is vulnerable, can be used by the government, insurance companies, or law enforcement. None of those entities can access the Ancestry database. If law enforcement wants to use the Ancestry database, they have to get a court order, and Ancestry more often than not will deny access to their database. So any of the high profile cases that you're seeing that are being used, that DNA is being used to solve, are not going through Ancestry. They're going through public databases. So Ancestry is very secure when it comes to your DNA information. And the other thing I tell people too is that if you want to do a test, but you're kind of concerned about your identity being out there, put an alias on your test. You don't need to use your real name. There are no email addresses associated with tests on Ancestry. All you need to do is put Jane Doe or John Doe if you are nervous about someone finding you. They'll find you, but they may not be able to figure out who you are. So that's just something that you can do. Don't feel that you have to put your real name on it. Okay, so who should we be testing to find out information? Generally, you want to test the oldest generation in your family. So if you've been tested, but your mother or your father or your grandparent or your aunt or uncle has not been tested, I would say you definitely want to get those older generations tested. I've been very lucky. I've had my mother test. I've had both of my in-laws test. Those tests have been invaluable for genealogy research because those people are a generation closer to the ancestors that we want to figure out. So it helps us when we're going through and looking at matches. If we can look at matches that belong to our parents or our grandparents, then we've got much closer to the generations that we're trying to understand and learn about. So definitely it's worth it to get the older generation tested. And it also will be saved as a lasting legacy when they're no longer with us. So it's definitely a good thing to do. If you don't have the option of an older generation, then test your siblings. They would be also a good help to have information on. Generally, I've had my son test. My nephew is tested. As you can see, I don't use their tests for anything really, because they're too much of a mixed bag of the things that I'm trying to look for. So I try to go into the older generations, and that's very helpful. All right, so more information. Where can I find information? So hopefully after this talk, I don't want to say that I want you to have more questions, but what I want you to do is I want you to be able to learn to explore on your own and to find answers for questions that you may have. Because it's important that we learn a lot. And the thing is that when you learn something new with DNA, the next day you're just going to learn something else. So it's an ongoing thing. It's never done. There are lots of websites, as you can imagine. All of the testing companies have help sections. Ancestry has a great help section. Ancestry also has a YouTube channel. So if you are a visual learner and you want to learn about how to look at your DNA and how to interpret your DNA, head to Ancestry's channel on YouTube. They have lots of great videos by Krista Cowan. She does very informative videos. She explains a lot about DNA. So she's a really great person to watch. So definitely check into those. The International Society of Genetic Genealogists, or otherwise known as ISOG, they have a wiki similar to Wikipedia, where if you want to learn about different terms or different types of things about DNA, that might be a good place to look. GEDmatch is a public DNA database that you have the option of uploading your DNA information to. That's also another very interesting thing to get into. And then there's Facebook groups. If you are a Facebook member, I cannot recommend Facebook groups high enough for genealogy in general, but for genetic genealogy in particular. The Facebook group Genetic Genealogy Tips and Techniques has about 60,000 members. There are probably 20 to 30 posts a day on that particular group. It's a wonderful group for learning. It's a very positive group. It's well monitored. There are great administrators. They answer questions. They keep all discussions on topic. So there's never any disintegration into political topics or anything. The focus is completely on genetic genealogy. So it's a wonderful group to join, and you will learn a lot by being in that group. There are lots of people blogging about genetic genealogy. The good news is that if you join a Facebook group like Genetic Genealogy Tips and Techniques, you're going to get updated whenever somebody posts something on their blog. So that's a good place to be continuously updated. All of these addresses are on the handout, so you don't have to feel the need to furiously write anything down. The book that I mentioned early in the program, the Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy, that is available at the library. I think it's at the Clifton Park Library. It's a great book to read. It's got a new edition that's just come out in the last probably 6 months. That's a wonderful book to read. It will give you the basics. Your DNA Guide, the book by Diane Southard, is also a great book. It gives you step-by-step instructions about how to work with your DNA. So it's very useful for those of us who like to have step-by-step instructions. The names that are on the right, if you join some of these Facebook groups, you will see these people posting on these groups. A name that probably jumps right out at you is Cece Moore. She's just recently had the Genetic Detective TV show on ABC. But all of these people are active participants in the Facebook genealogy groups. So bottom line is, here's what I recommend. If you have not done these things already, I would recommend purchasing your DNA test, set up your Ancestry account and register your kit, and then purchase a membership, whether it be for a month, 2 months, 6 months, whatever. Start your family tree and work on it. Send your DNA test in, link your DNA test to your family tree, and then see what the tools will do for you. See what you can find by the combination of doing your family tree and working with your matches. You can contact your matches via Ancestry. You can work together on your tree. If you are an Ancestry member, you can see the trees of your matches, which can be very helpful because a lot of them have very good family trees. So you may get some information. Others don't have great family trees, and still others don't have any. But if you have the option of being an Ancestry member, you will be able to see your matches trees, which is a great thing. Okay, a lot of stuff in there. So there's got to be some questions, and I'd be very happy to answer them.
So if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat or into the Q&A, and I will feed them to Lisa. We did have a question about the recording of this webinar, and it will be available on the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. It takes a day or two to have that happen, but if you just check back on the library's YouTube channel, you should find it soon. And you can find our YouTube channel by just going to the library's main webpage, cphlibrary.org, and then scrolling all the way down to the bottom, and you'll see links for Facebook and YouTube and Instagram. So that will take you to our YouTube channel. We've had somebody say wonderful, so thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
And again, our next webinar with Lisa is on August 10th at the same time. It's choosing and using genealogy software. And also, if you were interested in accessing American Ancestors while the library's computers are not available to you, you can respond to the email that I sent this morning with the link to this webinar. Just reply to that email and let me know that you'd like that login information for American Ancestors, and I will send it on to you. We have a question. What was the name of the lady on the Ancestry YouTube channel?
That's Krista Cowan, and it's spelled Kristacowan.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got a couple of thank yous, and the handout is very helpful, somebody said, so that's great.
Awesome. Great. It's a lot to absorb. I know it's really a lot. And I would encourage people to learn. I mean, like I said, I'm fairly new to this. Most of what I learned was from being a member of the Genetic Genealogy and Tips and Techniques Facebook group. I just read the posts. That was how I learned things. And I always say about a third of it is, you know, is like kind of, oh gosh, not that question again, the same question 5 times this week. And about a third of it is right where your learning curve is. And then about a third of it is way over your head. So it's really informative, and you will learn a lot, but it's great just to read. You know, you don't even have to post any questions. You can just read and you'll get a lot out of it.
That's great. Wonderful to have all these tools at our fingertips that didn't used to be available.
Yeah, it's crazy. They move faster than we can possibly absorb all of them.
Right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Okay, well, if anybody else has a question that they think of later, they can ask me on my Facebook page every Wednesday. So every Wednesday I'm available all day on my Upstate NY Genealogy by Lisa Dougherty Facebook page. So if you like that page, you can just ask me a question anytime on Wednesday, and I will be happy to answer it. So if you think of something between now and then write it in and I'll answer it for you.
Fantastic. And if you have any questions about the library too, while we're going through this strange time, feel free to email me as well, and I'll try to answer those for you also. So I know that can also be a little confusing right now. All right, well, I think that's all we have for today then. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone, and thank you very much, Lisa, for another fantastic presentation.
Yes, thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you next month.
All right, so long.